So we talked about the different types of selection. So directional selection can go both ways. Stabilizing selection makes normal look more normal, and disruptive selection takes your normal and splits it into either side of whatever the range is. So in this particular case, these birds, we're talking about beak shape and beak length. So beaks can get all over longer, or all of them can get shorter. They can become more middle of the road, or you could split so that you have a group that are smaller beaks and larger beaks. It just depends on what trait you're talking about. This can even go for things like the proboscis, which on a butterfly or a moth is their little mouthpiece. So it curls up when they're not using it, and then when they go to drink nectar or something like that, it uncurls. The length of that can vary, and that can experience selection. So it's any trait, any kind of trait can experience this. So some organisms can evolve swiftly. I just asked you guys how long you think evolution takes. Organisms that evolve or change quickly as a group tend to be organisms that have really short lifespans. So fruit flies are a good example. A lot of plants have short lifespans. Microbes, so pretty much anything microscopic counts. This is bacteria, mostly prokaryotes, but anything that has a short lifespan is able to have changes occur very quickly. So when we talk about humans, we don't see, or a lot of animals, we don't see, evolution as you would maybe typically think of it, simply because a lot of animals, and then humans, obviously live for a long time. But with a lot of things, changes in a population can occur quickly. So one example of this is this wonderful little squirrel. So at one point, they were all spread out in this area, and it was one population. But because of the distance, because a road was cut through the mountains or the hills, the two groups of squirrels were then separated from each other, so they were geographically isolated, and they underwent allopatric speciation. So they are different species now, and they can't breed together anymore because of enough changes have happened that they're different enough from each other. Okay. So sometimes evolution is problematic when we talk about germs and bugs evolving so that the flu vaccines don't work against them anymore. Generally, we think that's a detrimental thing to us personally as humans. Sometimes, though, evolution does work out to be helpful. So this particular example right here is POPs, which are persistent organic pollutants, and these are resistance or pollutants that we have put into the environment through industry, or maybe through trying different kinds of pesticides and insecticides. And one of the best ways to get rid of those is to look at the places where there's a high concentration of those, because the things that evolve to be able to eat those and use those and not be killed by them tend to exist in the area where it's heavily polluted. So if we want to find plants that are good at phytoremediation, remember that? Phytoremediation, what that is? Using plants to help pull contaminants out of the soil. Okay. If we want to find plants that are good at doing that, or if we want to find bacteria that are good at eating pollutants that are in the soil and converting those into non-toxic things, then we're better off looking for those things in the places where it is already contaminated, because that's where they're going to be. Okay. Taxonomy. I'm assuming you guys know some of the basics of taxonomy. So you should know that genus and species give us the scientific name. It's one of the things I have listed here. Just in general, it's good for you to know these three names. They're the domains. So there's bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And it would be good for you to know the 6 kingdoms that go underneath that. So before the taxonomy got reorganized, kingdom was the largest group, but now domain is the largest group. So of the 6 kingdoms, bacteria just has eubacteria in it. So that the kingdom eubacteria is in the domain bacteria. The kingdom, bless you, the kingdom archaeobacteria is in the domain archaea, bless you. And the other 4 kingdoms are all in domain eukarya. So Why did they change it? Largely because scientists, rather than looking at just the outside or the structure of an organism to classify it, started looking at DNA sequences. So that molecular evidence led scientists to want to reclassify things. And this classification and where different organisms get placed kind of on the tree of life and how we think they're related to each other changes almost daily. So it's a constant battle, I guess, if you want to call it that. That sounds way more dramatic than it is. But it's a constant process to try to keep up on that. So textbooks are almost always wrong when you're looking at how things are related to each other because textbooks are old. There are some classic examples that are probably still accurate, like we talked about the red panda not really being super closely related to the giant panda. That's a good example that we know is accurate. But if you look at a textbook that talks about some other relationships, they might not always be right. So you should just in general know those things. This figure underneath the sticky note kind of shows that. So when you're looking at a figure like this, if you're in AP Bio, you'll get lots of practice with these. These are called phylogenetic trees. And the way that this works is the further back you go, or sometimes they'll look like this. So then the further to the side you go, the older you get generally in time. And where things branch off, that's your common ancestors. So domains bacteria and archaea tend to be thought of as the oldest because we know that they have the oldest, most recent or common ancestor with each other. Everything in domain eukarya is going to be a eukaryote. So that means they have a nucleus, they have membrane-bound organelles. Everything in kingdom eubacteria and archaeobacteria do not have those, so they're prokaryotes. That's one of the big differences between the domains. Okay. So competition. Competition is something that species go through all the time, and there can be competition within the species, so like one human to another, or you can have competition between humans and animals, which would be different species. So intraspecific competition is the same species. Interspecific is between different species. And sometimes getting a question right comes down to, do you remember which is which? Okay? So inter is between different species, intra is the same species. So think intra is internal, and inter is just between. Okay? And you can compete, organisms can compete for all kinds of different things. So you can compete for space, you can compete for light, so plants would be competing for light from the sun. Organisms can compete for food and water, which we generally think of as competition. They can also compete for mates. So who gets to reproduce, who gets to have children, that's a competition. Maybe not so much for humans, but for the rest of the plant and animal world, okay? When we're talking about different types of relationships, predation is a fairly important one. Make sure I didn't skip anything, okay? So predation can affect how organisms survive or don't survive, obviously. And in predator-mediated competitions, that's this term here, something that is a better competitor and is maybe better prey gets a large population faster than the other species that are in that same area. So then if a predator in that habitat is eating multiple things, it will then start to eat whatever has a larger population, which means that helps control that population. So for example, we kind of talked about keystone species, and on Friday, the video that you guys watched with the starfish keep the urchin population under control. So if the urchins happen to grow and produce more than normal, the starfish would eat them and then they would be back under control. So it's kind of an example of that. Predators can help mediate and take care of some of the competition. So if you remove a predator from an area, then the competitor, like the urchin, that's better able to survive and can get rid of everything else, will just take over. So predators can help keep that from happening and help increase diversity because they're there. Okay. Look, that's a caterpillar. Did you know you aren't supposed to pick up a lot of caterpillars because they're poisonous? No, yeah, well, so a lot of caterpillars release toxins or things that you could be allergic to on their bristles or from their skin. No, yeah, this one doesn't have any fuzzes. But just in general, you really aren't supposed to pick them up. That doesn't mean that I don't think I always pick them up when I see them, but you're not really supposed to, apparently.
So if they're bad, then why don't we kill them?
What?
So
I mean, because they turn into beautiful butterflies.
they turn into, it depends. It depends. And really it depends on each individual person because some people are more allergic than others. So I picked up, there was one actually on my car a couple of weeks ago, and I picked it up and like
Did something happen?
no, I was fine. But I picked him up and put him in a cup because I was going to get a rat from the pet store. Came back, tried to feed the rat to my snake, and I had a student here who was waiting for me to see the rat eat, and he looked up. He was just like, "Is that poisonous? You know you're not supposed to pick them up." So he looked up poisonous caterpillars in Indiana, and he found the one that it was, and yeah, apparently it is poisonous. Some people have an allergic reaction to it, and I just didn't. So there you go. I skated an allergic reaction, which would not have been death because they're not all poisonous enough to kill you.
That doesn't.
But
Some of them now.
some of them could be, but I would think you probably have to eat them. But I avoided an allergic reaction. Congratulations. Okay. So when we're talking about predation, organisms have different adaptations to help them avoid getting eaten by predators. So camouflage is one. Body armor is another. Smelling really bad or tasting really bad is another, because if you have a predator that eats something that tastes bad, it's going to learn after enough times, don't eat that. I won't like how it tastes. Okay? So a lot of organisms end up looking like something else that is poisonous or that tastes bad, and then predators don't eat them too. It's called mimicry. So I can imitate looking like somebody that's a bad person, and people will leave me alone because I look like that bad person, or animal, or plant, or whatever. Okay. So there are two different types of that. There's Batesian mimicry and Mullerian mimicry. And I know I'm not saying that right. It's German. It's like a ooh sound, and I don't say it right. But essentially, the difference is just one organism in Batesian mimicry is actually harmful, and the other is not. So the one that looks like it's harmful but isn't benefits because predators do attack on occasion the one that is harmful. So there's a type of snake that has yellow and red and black banding, and if you look at the pattern of that, one of them is actually poisonous, and if you get bit by it, you better find a hospital. And I think they have the anti-venom for it. I'm not sure. But the other has the same colors, and they're in a different pattern, and the snake's harmless. You could pick it up and play with it, no problems. But it's just the pattern that makes a difference. And animals that eat the snakes just see the colors and they don't notice the pattern. So the one snake that's harmless benefits from the other one being very harmful. That's Batesian mimicry. In Mullerian mimicry, both organisms look like each other, and they both are distasteful or harmful, potentially dangerous. So they both benefit from the other one potentially being eaten. Okay. So some examples of adaptations. Plants. Plants can develop thick bark. They can develop thorns or nettles. Plants can also taste bad. So herbivores won't eat them, which sounds maybe kind of funny, but there are plants that cattle and things like that won't eat. They'll avoid because they taste bad. Animals can, again, odors, secretions, so they can smell bad or taste bad. They can develop body armor. They can also develop speed. So if you think of a cheetah, I'm sure you know that cheetahs are really fast, but they're fast for a short amount of time. Cheetahs hunt gazelles. Gazelles are also fast. They're just not quite as fast as a cheetah, but they have more stamina, so they can run longer. They also can jump and kind of turn around in the air. So if they can run a little bit longer and jump out of the way of the cheetah, then they can avoid the cheetah. So cheetahs aren't always successful when they hunt because they're hunting something else that is also fast. Okay, so that's an example of an adaptation. Symbiosis. These terms should sound really, really, really familiar So if you can give me a definition for them and one or two examples of each, you're good. Okay, but symbiosis is the idea that two organisms have a relationship with each other. And then what's that relationship look like? So they can both benefit. That would be mutualism. Okay, so they both are getting something good from it. It could be a commensalist or commensalistic relationship. So commensalism is where one member definitely benefits and the other one just isn't affected really. Okay, you can have parasitism. So one benefits, the other's harmed. And there are a couple of other examples of symbiotic relationships in the Barron's book. So one of them is actually called saprotrophism, which is anything that eats something that's dead. Okay, so the one is dead and the other organism is eating it. It didn't kill it, it died by itself, but it's eating it and it's dead. That's technically a type of symbiosis. I think it's a funny one, but apparently it's symbiotic. So lichens are an example of a mutualistic relationship. I'm just going to go through these ones. So lichens are algae and, now I'm not going to remember it, moss, I think. And they, or fungus and something that's photosynthetic, so it can be a bacteria or it can be algae. And they work together to get more nutrients like water, and the fungus helps hold water. The algae helps produce food for the fungus to eat. So they both benefit from that relationship. The oxpecker and the impala, oh look, aren't they so cute? The oxpecker helps take flies and bugs off of the impala, and the birds kind of get a free ride. And bromeliads, they're a type of plant that grows on trees in the tropics. They don't hurt the tree at all because they don't burrow into it, they don't break it apart or tear it down, but they benefit because the tree surface, the tree bark, gives them a place to grow. Okay, so that's an example of commensalism. I'm sure you can come up with your own examples of parasites. There are a lot of bacteria that are parasites, tapeworms are parasites. Now this particular page I just think is fascinating. It's about the microbiome, which is all of the trillions of bacteria and other organisms that live on and in you. And yes, it is like 90 trillion little friends. There are more things living on and in you than are cells that make up you. So I think you have about 10 trillion cells and there's about 90 trillion things living on you. So yeah, I mean, you know, you're gonna go home and take a really hot, long shower, right? So one of the reasons this is possible is because prokaryotes are a lot smaller than eukaryotic cells. So you can have a lot of things that live on you and take up less space than the rest of your body. And a lot of the things that are in your microbiome are actually beneficial for you. So they help with the health of your skin and the health of your gut and your ability to absorb different kinds of food. So it's interesting when you look at studies of different people's gut bacteria, and some of the stuff that's referenced in here I'll just mention. They talk about mice who are obese and fat. If they get a transplant of fecal matter, which is, yes, matter from the colon, so poop that hasn't been pooped out yet. If you get a transfer of that from a mouse that's lean and healthy and that gets put into the mouse that's obese, then the mouse that's obese loses weight. And vice versa. If you take a transplant from an obese mouse and you put it in a mouse that's lean and healthy, it gains weight. That's directly related to the type of bacteria that the mice have in their guts. Lucas?
They actually do that with people.
They could do that with people, potentially. I think the problem, or the possibility of transferring other diseases is kind of a concern. But we do that with a disease that's called C. diff. C. diff stands for Clostridium differentiae or difficile. Clostridium difficile, it's right here. Where do we go? Clostridium difficile. This is an infection that my husband saw a lot at the hospitals. It's very contagious, and once you have it, it's very difficult to get rid of. So C. diff is a type of bacteria that lives in the gut, and you can tell if someone has C. diff by a couple of different symptoms. But one of the best ways, or one of the successful ways, not one of the best ways, just one of the successful ways to help get rid of it is to take a transplant of someone's healthy fecal matter and implant it into the person's fecal digestive tract. So there's a couple ways to do that. Here they talk about, Yeah, C. diff. So C. diff, let's see, infects 250,000 a year and kills 14,000. That's just in the U.S.
What does it like do though? Like what?
Dehydrates you
Oh.
a lot, and because it's a bacteria that's living on the food in your gut, it means you have poor nutrition, so you're not digesting things and absorbing the nutrients the right way. You eat things, and then it eats the things you eat instead of you getting to eat the things you eat. Okay, but yeah, you can get the sample of the microbiome from a healthy person and implant it. They can use a feeding tube to do that, so they would put that into your stomach. Or this is the gross part. You can have frozen encapsulated pellets of feces.
How does that stop it? I don't get it. Like,
So inside of your gut are healthy bacteria. If I have an infection and I have a lot of bacteria that are not healthy and they've taken over and killed off everything else in my gut, your healthy bacteria can help fight that off for me.
oh.
Literally eating
That's
someone
how it
else's
works. So yeah, if literally you eat someone else's poop, you get better. Not something you thought we'd talk about in class, right? This is more like an AP Bio thing, but I find it fascinating, so we're talking a little bit more about it, okay? A couple things about mutualism that you need to know. Mutualism can involve coevolution, so two things that change over time in response to each other, which means they have a very specialized relationship. And it can develop very quickly. So this is an example of a flower that Charles Darwin saw. I think it's Charles Darwin. Let me look. Yeah, Charles Darwin saw. And he predicted that there had to be some sort of a moth or an insect with a very long proboscis that could reach down to the bottom of the flower to eat it. A century later, they found the moth. So this moth is the only thing that can eat from this flower.
Wait, is he the dude?
Charles
No,
Darwin?
never mind.
You know who he is.
What is
Who was
that,
the one that did the little?
The what? What's the what? Lucas? Oh, this is, so these are called Freudian slips. So, a Freudian slip is when you are thinking one thing and you try to say it, but something else comes out. There's a specific, Freudian slips are more specific than that, but it's just a notepad that I had at home because I did this while we were driving. So, I read and was playing with my child with my other hand. Here, have a toy. Pay attention, okay? So we talked about keystone species. That's kind of described here. You should be able to give a couple examples of those. When we think keystone species, scientists used to think that was just the top predators, but that's not always the case. So tropical figs are actually an example of a keystone species. So they're a type of tree that grow and produce fruit even in the dry season. If you removed those plants, then everything that relies on that fruit during the dry seasons would die. So they're considered a keystone species. Elephants clear vegetation. They walk over it, they eat a lot of vegetation, so they trample it or they eat it. And also they can actually pick up trees and pull them out of the ground. So they do that sometimes too. And that clearing of vegetation helps keep the savannas and grasslands as savannas and grasslands. If they didn't do that, then those would get taken over. Okay. From the video, you should recognize the starfish and otters as keystone species and be able to give those as examples. Another example of keystone species is actually a lot of types of fungus. So fungus and fungi can form mutualistic relationships with tree roots. So they combine and kind of embed themselves into the tree roots, and that means that they give the tree access to nutrients and water, and then they get nutrients and nutrition from the tree. So that's a mutualistic relationship. It's called mycorrhizae, so that's a funky looking word. But they're a keystone species as well. If you got rid of the fungus, then a lot of trees would not be able to grow where they're growing today. So there are dozens of different kinds of fungus that do this for trees. Okay. So you should be able to give a couple of examples of keystone species and talk about why they're important. Primary productivity. We kind of talked about that briefly. Primary productivity is the amount of photosynthesis essentially that occurs. So you're looking at how quickly biomass is produced by plants. That's primary productivity. So you can calculate the net primary productivity by looking at how much, what the GPP, the gross primary productivity is, minus the rate of cellular respiration. So that allows you to calculate your net primary productivity. So what you're doing is figuring what's your rate of building up organisms. So how quickly do the organisms in the area grow? How quickly do you see like new plant growth? And to calculate that, you have to take the rate of solar energy being converted to chemical energy. That's your gross primary productivity. And you subtract that from everything that's needed to support life. So if this is all the energy that plants convert to glucose, and then this is the energy that the plants use, what's left is your net primary productivity. It's what's left over to build the plants. Okay. Just in general, a couple of statements. I pulled these after doing reading, so you can avoid reading this page if you want to. In general, environments with a lot of water and light and nutrients and warmer temperatures are going to have a higher productivity. Okay, if you have higher temperatures, that means you have more sunlight. It also means chemical reactions take place more quickly. It means that the growing season is probably longer, so things can grow better during that time. If there are lots of nutrients, then things are able to grow well because there's a lot of food. If there's enough water, again, they can grow well because there's enough water to perform all the chemical reactions necessary. Marine ecosystems, in general, are usually less productive than terrestrial ecosystems. Why do you think that is?
Sunlight, I guess.
It's not the salt.
Huh?
It's not the salt.
Is it sunlight?
Oh, sunlight. It's okay. I can see that. Sometimes the ocean is called an aquatic desert because the open ocean does not have a lot of activity, productivity going on. So marine environments tend to have lower levels of productivity. Because of the lack of nutrients. So there's not a lot of places for them to get nutrition from. Okay, it's not necessarily the depth of the ocean, although that can play into it too. But there's just not a lot of nutrients out in the middle of the ocean. Things tend to congregate along the shorelines because that's where stuff is washed off of the shore. So fertilizers and things like that organisms can eat are more populous there. Okay. This is an example of that. This chart takes, here's all the biomes, here's what their productivity is. So we've got really high numbers for places where there's the tropical rainforest and estuaries, so warm temperatures, lots of sunlight, lots of water. The open ocean and deserts are really low. Okay. When we're talking about diversity, there's two different numbers that you should look at. There's abundance, which is just how many organisms are there total. And then there's diversity, which is actually looking at how many different species are present. And the relationship between these two, with diversity, the more number of species you have, usually the fewer you have of each of those species. So if there are 10 different species in an area, you might only have 5 members of each species in that area. If one species has 50 members, you might have a low diversity and only have 2 or 3 different species. So having higher diversity actually means usually having less of a specific organism in that area, in that habitat. Ecological structure looks at 3 different patterns. So it can either be random, or uniform, or clustered. And you should be able to give an example of those. Just one example of each would be fine. So fish tend to travel in clumps or schools. Some plants spread out uniformly. A lot of plants are just dispersed though by the wind or water or by organisms that eat the food and then take the seeds elsewhere.
So would humans be random?
That probably depends on what area you're talking about. But humans tend to clump together. We have really big cities and open areas, especially in the U.S., where no one is living. Okay. So structure can also be vertical or horizontal. If you look at a lake, there's vertical layers. If you look at the rainforest, there are vertical layers. So the structure can be different based on height and not just spread out over an area. Complexity if you're talking about the complexity of a system, is looking at the number of species per trophic level. So how many producers are there? How many primary consumers? How many secondary consumers, etc. So complexity looks at that, and it also looks at how many different levels are there total. So does your community only have primary consumers, or do you have tertiary consumers? The more levels you have, the more complex it is. And there are 3 different types of stability and resilience for a community. So this is a community's ability to not change and to resist change, and to recover if there is a disturbance or if there is change. So there's constancy, there's inertia, and there's renewal. Okay, and these are described right here. Okay. You don't necessarily need to know these. I'm not going to ask you a question about them, but it's a good thing for you to be familiar with, in terms for you to know. Okay. Edge effects. How many of you have passed by a cornfield recently? Is there a clump of trees by it? Maybe.
Just like a few small clumps of trees every
Okay.
once in a while.
That type of habitat is much different than a true forest. So edge effects are the idea that when you go from one biome to another, or one ecosystem or habitat to another, the transition point between the two looks different than either of the actual 2 different habitats. So ecotone is the term used to refer to the boundary between different communities or different zones. Sometimes the boundary looks completely different than the other 2 relationships. So some terms to know or be aware of are habitat fragmentation. This is something that we do when we cut down a forest to clear cut it, and I will stop there and we'll